9,000 pounds of molten steel, liquid metal at 2,800 degrees. One bad spout. October 1907, Butler, Pennsylvania. A cupola furnace at the Standard Steel Car Company is running full blast when a ladle containing enough molten steel to build 3 railroad cars tips and spills onto wet sand. The explosion that follows doesn't just kill. It cooks men alive. 4 die instantly. 20 more burn to death over the coming hours and days. The blast destroys a building the size of a city block, showers molten metal like water from a burst pipe, and shakes the town hard enough that people a mile away think it's an earthquake. This is the story of a machine that built America's railroads and the men who fed it. We're going to walk into that foundry, stand next to that cupola, and understand exactly what went wrong. Because this wasn't just an accident. This was physics meeting carelessness, and the bill came due in screaming and fire. By the time we're done, you'll know why they called it Hell's Kitchen and why some men refused to work the night shift ever again. We're going to find out how liquid steel became a bomb and why 24 families lost everything in 30 seconds. When Titans needed wheels, America in 1902 had a problem. The railroads were hemorrhaging money and lives. Wooden freight cars, the backbone of American commerce, were splintering, collapsing, catching fire. A derailment didn't just mean lost cargo. It meant wooden shrapnel, burning freight, and bodies crushed under tons of timber. The companies knew it. The public knew it. But steel railroad cars? Nobody had figured out how to mass-produce them cheap enough to matter. The numbers told the story. A wooden boxcar lasted maybe 10 years if you were lucky, 5 if you ran heavy freight. They cracked in winter, warped in summer, and turned into kindling the moment a wheel jumped the track. Insurance companies were bleeding railroads dry. The public was demanding change. But steel cars cost 3 times what wooden ones did, and the few companies building them couldn't produce enough to supply even one major railroad, let alone the entire country. The problem wasn't the concept. Steel worked. Everyone knew steel worked. The problem was the manufacturing. Every steel car was essentially custom-built, each component pressed from sheet steel using expensive dies that only fit one design. Change the dimensions? New dies, new jigs, new everything. It was slow, it was expensive, and it couldn't scale. Enter John Hanson, chief engineer at Pressed Steel Car Company in Pittsburgh. Brilliant, methodical, obsessed with standardization. Hanson looked at the custom-stamped steel cars his employer was building. Expensive, slow, requiring specialized dies for every component, and saw waste. He had a better idea. Use standard steel shapes. Channels, angles, beams, already rolling out of mills by the thousands. Build them fast, build them cheap, build them identical. Make every part interchangeable. Turn railroad car production into an assembly line before Henry Ford made assembly lines famous. Hanson had proven the concept at Pressed Steel with a single design, steel hoppers built from standard channel and angle shapes. Simple, economical, and they worked. He'd built 600 of them. But his bosses weren't interested in changing their entire philosophy. They'd invested millions in custom stamping equipment. They weren't going to abandon it for Hanson's vision, so Hanson quit, and he brought a partner, James Buchanan Brady. Diamond Jim to anyone who'd met him. A salesman so legendary, so flamboyant, so good at closing deals that railroad executives would buy cars just to get him to leave their offices. The man wore diamonds on his cufflinks, his tie pins, his watch chain. He threw parties at Delmonico's in New York that cost more than most men made in a year. He once gave a showgirl a bicycle with handlebars plated in mother of pearl and every spoke set with a tiny diamond, and he could sell anything to anyone. Brady wasn't an engineer. He was a force of nature. He understood what railroad men wanted: cheap, fast, reliable, and he knew how to make them believe he could deliver it. He'd been Pressed Steel's top salesman. When he heard Hanson was leaving, he saw the same opportunity Hanson did: mass production, standardized parts, a fortune waiting to be built. But they had a problem. You can't build a railroad car factory on vision and charm. You need capital, real capital. They needed money, $3 million in 1902. That's about $100 million in today's money, enough to build a small city, enough to make most bankers laugh you out of their office. They went to Andrew Mellon, one of the richest men in America, Pittsburgh banking royalty. Mellon looked at Hanson's designs, looked at Brady's sales contracts, and wrote the check. On January 2, 1902, they incorporated Standard Steel Car Company, Hanson as president, Brady as vice president of sales. By the time they broke ground in April, Brady had already sold 6,000 railroad cars. The factory didn't exist yet. The machines weren't installed. The workers hadn't been hired. But Brady had the orders. Hanson would build the cars, and Butler, Pennsylvania, a sleepy town 30 miles north of Pittsburgh, was about to become a steel empire. Why Butler? They'd originally planned to build in Beaver Falls. Everything was surveyed, the layout established, machinery and materials loaded onto railroad cars and ready to go. But the city government couldn't agree on rail line placement. Negotiations collapsed. They needed a new site fast, and Butler offered them everything they needed: land, rail access, water from Connoquenessing Creek for cooling, and a workforce desperate for jobs. They built the plant on 224 acres of old fairgrounds, a pickle factory, and a brickyard. 1/2 mile long under one roof, the largest structure of its kind in the world. 15 miles of railroad track threading through the property. Cupola furnaces roaring 24 hours a day, melting scrap iron and pig iron into the molten steel they'd pour into molds for wheels, couplers, bolsters, and frames. August 31st, 1902. The first car rolls off the line. A steel hopper for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. Hanson's design, standard parts, built in Butler. Car number 23001. It would haul coal for the next 20 years. By 1907, they're cranking out 125 cars a day, employing 6,000 men. Most of them Eastern European immigrants, Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, Italians who'd crossed the ocean with nothing and found work in Butler's Inferno. The company built them houses, boxcar red clapboard shacks in 3 rows, 6 families per house, communal showers and toilets in between. They called it Red Row. The town that grew around the factory was named Lindora, after Hanson's daughter Linda and his wife Dora. The company was printing money. Brady was selling cars to France, to Brazil, to every railroad in North America. Hanson's standardized designs were proving out, cheap, fast, strong. In January 1907, they shipped 2,836 cars in a single month, a record. And in one single day, they completed 125 cars from start to finish, the fastest production rate in the industry. But there was a price. There's always a price. To make steel railroad cars, you need steel. Thousands of tons of it, melted, cast, forged, rolled. And to melt steel in 1907, you need a cupola furnace. That's where the nightmare lived. That's where 24 men would die. The question everyone would ask afterward: could it have been prevented? We're about to find out. The Throat of Fire picture: a steel cylinder 10 feet across and 30 feet tall, lined with fire brick a foot thick, open at the top for loading, toyeres, air nozzles ringing the bottom third, blasting forced air into the inferno. At the very base, a tap hole plugged with clay, and below that, a well where molten metal pools. That's a cupola furnace, a vertical blast furnace, continuous operation. You charge it from the top. Coke, limestone flux, scrap iron, pig iron, alloying metals, and you blast air through the tuyeres. The coke burns white hot, 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, melting everything above it. The molten metal trickles down through the burning coke bed, absorbing carbon, picking up silicon and manganese from the additives, dripping into the well at the bottom as liquid steel. When the well fills, you tap it. Knock out the clay plug with a hammer and a pointed iron bar. The molten steel flows down a trough into a ladle, a barrel-shaped steel vessel lined with refractory brick, mounted on a tilting axle so it can be poured. 9,000 pounds of liquid steel, 4.5 tons, glowing orange-white, hot enough to melt your boots through the soles if you stand too close, hot enough to ignite wood from 15 feet away just from radiant heat. The physics are elegant. The execution is brutal. You're dealing with temperatures that turn steel into liquid in a continuous process that never stops, operated by men working 12-hour shifts in a building with no ventilation, no climate control, and no safety equipment beyond canvas aprons and leather gloves. The ladle tender's job is to position the ladle, receive the molten steel from the tap hole, then transport it, usually by overhead crane or rail-mounted trolley, to the molds where it'll be cast into wheels or couplings or structural pieces. It's a ballet of heat and weight and timing. Ladles weigh tons even when empty. Full, they're swaying, sloshing bombs of liquid fire. Here's what makes this dangerous. That ladle is suspended on a support mechanism, usually a pair of steel brackets called trunnions that fit into bearings, allowing the ladle to tilt for pouring. The brackets are cast iron. Heavy duty, yes, but they're being thermally cycled every single day, heated when the molten steel pours in, cooled when the ladle empties, expansion and contraction, microscopic cracks forming in the cast iron, stress fractures you can't see, and nobody's inspecting them because inspection costs time and money. And Standard Steel Car is producing 125 cars a day. The operators, the cupola tenders, the ladle men, the molders, aren't stupid. They're skilled. They know the furnace. They know the metal. They've done this 1,000 times, but they're working 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in a building that's 120 degrees in summer, in an era with no safety regulations, no OSHA, no workers' comp. If you get hurt, you're fired. If you die, your family gets nothing, and they replace you with the next immigrant off the boat. And here's the thing about cupola furnaces. They're continuous. You don't turn them off at the end of a shift. You don't cool them down for the weekend. Once they're lit, they run. Days, weeks, sometimes months. The coke bed at the bottom is always burning. The metal is always melting. The ladles are always moving, which means the floor around the furnace is always wet. Not intentionally, but condensation from the humid Pennsylvania air, water from cooling the molds, spillage from the quench tanks, leaks from overhead pipes, puddles, damp sand used in the mold-making process, moisture everywhere, and everyone in the foundry knows the rule, the iron law of molten metalwork. Water and molten steel don't mix. When water hits molten steel, or when molten steel hits water, the water doesn't just boil. It explodes. Instantaneous conversion to steam. A single gram of water becomes 1,671 grams of steam. Expansion factor of 1,671 to 1. If that steam is trapped or confined, the pressure spike is catastrophic. The molten metal aerosolizes, shatters into a spray of white-hot droplets, and the expanding steam blasts it outward like a bomb. The science is simple and terrifying. Water boils at 212 degrees. Molten steel is 2,800 degrees. When they meet, the water superheats instantly, trapped beneath liquid metal. It flash vaporizes. All that expansion has to go somewhere, so it explodes outward, fragmenting the molten steel into millions of droplets at lethal velocity. Every foundryman knows this. It's beaten into you on day one. Keep the floor dry. Check the ladles for cracks. Inspect the refractory lining. Never, ever pour molten metal onto wet sand or into a damp mold. The consequences are instant and hideous. But Standard Steel Car Company in 1907 is producing 125 cars a day. Production quotas are brutal. Shifts are long. Maintenance is expensive. And the men working the cupola furnaces are tired, overworked, and operating equipment that has no margin for error. The cupola at Butler was designated cupola number 1. There were others in the plant, but number 1 fed the wheel plant, a 150 by 100-foot building dedicated to casting the wheels, axles, and couplings that held railroad cars together. Critical components. High-volume production. The cupola ran hot and fast, tapped multiple times per shift, producing ladle after ladle of molten steel that would be poured into sand molds arranged across the foundry floor. The furnace doesn't care, it just melts. 9,000 pounds at a time, over and over, day after day, waiting for the one moment when everything goes wrong. And in October 1907, 6 months into the most productive year in Standard Steel Car's history, that moment was coming. The men who fed the beast, the cupola tenders. Name is lost to history, so are most of the workers. What we know is this: they were almost all foreigners, Eastern European immigrants, Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, men who spoke broken English or none at all, men who'd come to Butler because Standard Steel Car Company was hiring and the pay was better than anything they could get back home. They came for the promise of steady work, a paycheck, a future. The company advertised across Europe, agents in ports from Bremen to Trieste, spreading the word. America, jobs, steel, better than the farms, better than the mines, better than the factories back home where you worked 16 hours and still couldn't feed your family. So they came, by the thousands, through Ellis Island, by train to Pittsburgh, by streetcar to Butler, carrying everything they owned in a single trunk. Most of them had never seen a factory before, let alone a cupola furnace. But they learned. They had to. The company could convincingly argue, and did, that the language barrier made accidents inevitable. Instructions shouted across a roaring foundry floor in English, understood by men whose native tongue was Polish or Slovak. Safety warnings lost in translation, panic orders misinterpreted. But the men weren't careless. They were desperate. 12-hour days, 7 days a week, no overtime, no sick days, no protection if you got hurt. If you complained, there were 10 men waiting outside the gate to take your job. If you died, your widow got nothing. Maybe the church would pass a hat. Maybe your family would starve. The pay was decent by 1907 standards, $1.90 to $5 a day, depending on your job and skill level. The cupola tender, the man in charge of the furnace, might make $4 or $5 a day. The laborers shoveling coke and scrap into the top of the furnace made less than $2. But even $2 a day was more than most of these men had ever seen in the old country. So they worked. So you worked. You learned the furnace. You learned to read the color of the molten steel by eye. Cherry red too cold, orange white just right, white yellow too hot and dangerous. You learned to hear the roar of the blast, the hiss of the slag, the deep liquid rumble of the well filling. You learned where to stand, where not to stand, which spots on the floor stayed dry, and which ones were slick with condensation. And you learned fear. The cupola furnace didn't have a nickname at Standard Steel Car. Not like some machines earned, Widowmaker, Man-Eater, Death Trap. But the men who worked it didn't need a name. They knew what it could do. Burns were common. Minor ones, splashes on the forearm, droplets through a tear in your canvas apron, those you wrapped and kept working. Major ones, a ladle spill, a trough overflow, molten metal down your boot. Those sent you to the hospital or the grave. The burns weren't the only danger. The heat itself could kill you. In summer, the temperature inside the wheel plant hit 130 degrees. Add the radiant heat from the cupola and the ladles, and men were collapsing from heat exhaustion every week. Dehydration, heat stroke. Your vision would tunnel. Your legs would give out. And if you were standing too close to the molten metal when you fell, that was it. Then there was the dust. Fine particles of coke, iron oxide, limestone. You breathed it every shift. It coated your lungs, settled in your throat. Men who worked the cupola for 10 years developed a cough that never went away. By 40, they were struggling to breathe. By 50, most were dead. Silicosis, they called it later. But in 1907, it was just the price of the job. Every shift had a close call, a ladle swaying too far on the crane, a tap hole plug blowing out early, a chunk of damp scrap exploding when it hit the molten bath. The men near the furnace worked with one eye on the metal and one eye on the exits, because if something went catastrophically wrong, you had seconds, not minutes, seconds. The maintenance was constant and brutal. The refractory lining inside the cupola and the ladles wore down from the heat. Cracks formed, gaps opened. You had to patch them with fresh refractory clay by hand, often while the furnace was still hot. Bearings on the ladle axles had to be greased every 6 hours, manual greasing. While the ladle was in use, the worst job was replugging the tap hole. After you tapped the furnace and the molten steel drained into the ladle, you had to jam a fresh clay plug into the tap hole before the next batch of metal pooled in the well. You did this with a long iron rod, shoving wet clay into a hole that was still radiating 2,000-degree heat, while standing close enough to feel your face blistering. Miss the hole, take too long, and molten steel starts leaking out onto the floor. Then you're running. The worst part? You couldn't see the danger coming. The ladle looked fine. The support brackets looked fine. The refractory lining looked fine. But microscopic cracks were forming. Metal fatigue was accumulating. The thermal cycling, heat, cool, hundreds of times, was weakening the cast iron. And nobody was checking. Nobody was measuring. Nobody was calculating the safe operating life of a ladle support bracket because that science didn't exist yet. Nobody refused to work the cupola, not openly, because refusal meant firing, and firing meant no job, and no job meant no food for your family. But some men, after a bad scare, would quietly ask for a transfer to the machine shop, the paint department, anywhere away from the furnace. Most of the time they were told no. Production demands, orders to fill, get back to work. So they worked, for months, for years, until the furnace took them, or age did, or their lungs filled with foundry dust, and they coughed themselves to death at 45. For 6 months, in 1907, the cupola at Standard Steel Car ran like clockwork. No major accidents, no deaths. Production was strong. Brady was selling cars faster than Hansen could build them. The company was at its peak. They'd just shipped 2,836 cars in January, a record that made headlines in the industry. The furnaces were running 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The wheel plant was operating at maximum capacity. And then came October 6th, late evening shift, the worst possible time for something to go wrong. Skeleton crew, tired men, shadows everywhere because the electric lighting was dim and half the bulbs had burned out weeks ago, and maintenance hadn't replaced them yet. 30 seconds in hell. October 6th, 1907, late evening shift. The cupola is running hot. The well is full. Time to tap. The cupola tender gives the signal. The ladle is positioned beneath the tap hole. A steel barrel 4 feet across, lined with refractory brick, mounted on its tilting axle, ready to receive 9,000 pounds of molten steel. The tender breaks the clay plug with his iron bar. The tap hole opens. Liquid steel begins to flow, orange-white, glowing, beautiful, and deadly. It pours down the trough in a smooth stream, splashing into the waiting ladle with a hiss and a shower of sparks. And something goes wrong. The exact sequence isn't recorded in company documents. There are no official reports, no investigations by government inspectors. Those didn't exist yet. What we have are newspaper accounts, second-hand testimonies, and the physical evidence of what happened next. The most credible account says this: the ladle's support span broke, a structural failure in the mechanism that held the ladle level beneath the spout. Maybe a crack in the cast iron bracket, maybe metal fatigue from months of thermal stress, maybe poor maintenance, a bolt that wasn't tightened, a weld that was never inspected. The span breaks, the ladle tilts. 9,000 pounds of molten steel, already pouring from the tap hole, sloshes violently to one side. Some of it stays in the ladle, most of it doesn't. It spills onto the foundry floor, onto the wet sand used for mold making, onto the damp concrete, onto puddles of water that condensation and careless washing had left behind. And then the floor explodes. Not figuratively, literally. When molten steel at 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit hits water, the water doesn't have time to boil normally. It flash converts to steam. Expansion, 1,671 to 1 in milliseconds, confined beneath a layer of liquid metal. The pressure has nowhere to go but out. The explosion tears through the foundry, a steam blast so violent it shatters the ladle, fragments the trough, and aerosolizes the molten steel into a spray of white-hot droplets. Streams of burning metal pour outward in every direction, like water from a burst pipe, exactly as the newspapers will describe it. Liquid fire showering down on the men working the cupola, the men moving molds, the men who happened to be in the wrong place when physics turned savage. The sound is indescribable. A roar, a crack like thunder, the scream of tearing metal, and then, immediately, the screaming of men. 4 men die instantly. Nick Dorna, disemboweled by the blast. The force of the explosion tears him open, spilling his insides onto the foundry floor. Nicholas Blotar, burned to a crisp where he stood. He's standing directly in the path of the molten metal spray when it hits him. His body carbonizes in seconds. John Varick, skull crushed by flying debris. A chunk of the shattered ladle, moving like shrapnel, hits him in the head. He's dead before he hits the ground. One more man, never identified, totally dismembered, blown apart so completely that they can't even tell who he was. Maybe he was standing on top of the explosion when it went off. Maybe he was right next to the ladle when it failed. Either way, there's not enough left to identify. 20 more men are on fire. Molten steel has splashed onto them, through their canvas aprons, down their boots, into their eyes. Some are engulfed, literally cooked alive, their skin carbonizing, their clothing vaporized. The ones still standing are screaming, running, trying to rip off their burning clothes with hands that are also burning. The men near the cupola, 20 of them, have every shred of clothing blown off by the force of the explosion. They're standing naked, skin red and black and peeling, steam rising off their bodies, too shocked to understand what just happened. The wheel plant, 150 feet by 100 feet, a building the size of a warehouse, is demolished. The roof collapses, the walls buckle, support beams crack and fall. The cupola itself is damaged, cracked, leaking molten metal and slag onto what's left of the floor. The secondary explosions start almost immediately. Pockets of water trapped under debris, heating up, bursting. Each one sprays more molten metal. Each one starts more fires. The blast wave shakes buildings a mile away. People in downtown Butler feel the ground tremble and think it's an earthquake. They rush out of their homes, see the glow of fire in the direction of the Standard Steelworks, and panic. Is it the whole factory? Is it spreading? Windows rattled in frames. Dishes fell from shelves. A few people later swore they heard the explosion itself, a deep boom that rolled across the town like distant thunder. Inside the wreckage, men are buried under collapsed beams and rubble. It takes an hour to pull them all out. Some are alive. Most of those will die anyway. The ones who can walk are staggering toward the exits, hands pressed against burns, blind from the flash, leaving trails of scorched fabric and blood on the floor. The rescue effort is chaos. Other workers rush in from different parts of the factory. They're pulling beams off bodies. They're dragging men out of the wreckage. They're trying to smother the flames with sand, with water, with their bare hands. But the molten steel is still there, still burning, still radiating enough heat to ignite anything that gets close. Some are alive. Most of those will die anyway. Burns over 70%, 80%, 90% of their bodies. No skin grafts, no burn units, no morphine drip, no intravenous fluids, no antibiotics. Just agony, infection, and slow death over the next hours and days. They take the injured to Butler Hospital. The physicians are overwhelmed. They've never seen burns like this. They do what they can. Bandages, ointments, laudanum for the pain. But there's nothing they can do for burns this severe. The skin is gone. The tissue underneath is cooked. Infection sets in within hours. Gangrene within days. The physicians attending the injured say at midnight that at least 10 more men will die. They're wrong. It's worse. Over the coming days and weeks, 20 more men succumb to their burns. Some die within hours. Some last a day. Some hang on for a week, delirious with fever, their bodies shutting down organ by organ. Total dead, 24. Total seriously injured, 10 more who will live but never work again. Fingers gone, arms gone, eyes burned out, legs burned to the bone. Men in their 20s and 30s, reduced to invalids, unable to work, unable to support their families. Nearly all the men were foreigners. The newspapers note this, not with sympathy, just as a fact. Foreigners, immigrants, replaceable. The Pittsburgh papers run the story on page 3. The New York papers don't run it at all. Just another industrial accident. Just another batch of workers killed by the machinery that was building America. The cause of the explosion, according to the newspaper, the upsetting of a metal pot in the cupola, which contained 5,000 pounds of molten metal ready for casting. A span in the pot broke, allowing the liquid iron to spill over the wet sand. An explosion followed so quickly that none of the workmen in the building had a chance to escape. 5,000 pounds. £9,000. The accounts conflict, it doesn't matter. Enough molten steel to kill everyone in the room. Buildings in the city, a mile from the explosion, shivered as if shaken by an earthquake. People rushed from their homes, panic-stricken. Thousands turned out to watch the fire that followed, the cupola still burning, the wreckage smoldering, the smell of burned flesh and molten metal drifting through the October night. They stood outside the factory gates, watching the glow, listening to the screams that carried on the wind. Standard Steel Car Company's loss, $100,000 in property damage, one cupola furnace destroyed, one wheel plant demolished, production halted for repairs. That's about $3 million in today's money. Significant, yes, but not catastrophic. The company was insured. They'd rebuild. The human cost, 24 men dead, 10 more crippled for life, families destroyed, widows left with no income, children left fatherless. No compensation, no workers' comp, no lawsuits that went anywhere. In an era before government oversight of factories, workers were held responsible for their own safety. If you sued your employer, you'd lose. Courts consistently ruled in favor of the companies. The logic was simple. You knew the job was dangerous when you took it. You accepted the risk. If you got hurt, that was on you. Standard Steel Car could, and did, argue that the men were careless, that the language barrier made accidents inevitable, that industrial work was inherently dangerous, and everyone knew the risks. They'd argue that maintaining a dry floor was impossible in a foundry environment. They'd argue that the ladle support failure was an act of God, unforeseeable, unavoidable, and the courts would agree. The dead were buried. The injured were sent home to die or heal on their own, and Standard Steel Car bounced back from the disaster. Within weeks, production resumed. New workers were hired. The cupola was rebuilt. Orders kept coming in. Brady kept selling. Hansen kept designing. By 1909, the explosion was barely a footnote in the company's history, but something had changed. Not at Standard Steel Car, not yet, but out in the world, people were starting to pay attention. Steel's cold verdict. Standard Steel Car Company didn't just survive the explosion, it thrived. By 1930, the company had produced over 350,000 railroad cars. It had plants in Indiana, France, Brazil. It employed thousands. Pullman Inc. bought the company for $57 million. $51 million in stock. $6 million million. $51 million in stock. $6 million in cash. And merged it into Pullman Standard, one of the largest railroad car manufacturers in the world. The Butler plant kept running for another 75 years, through the Depression, through 2 world wars, building freight cars, passenger cars, subway cars for New York City, building munitions during WWI, building the steel backbone of American transportation. At its peak in the 1950s, it employed over 6,000 workers and produced railroad cars that rolled from coast to coast. The men who died in 1907 are remembered in historical society, archives and genealogy forums. Their names, the ones we have, are listed in disaster databases: Nick Dorna, Nicholas Blotar, John Varick, and 21 more men whose names we'll never know for certain because the company didn't care enough to record them. No memorial, no plaque, just a line in a newspaper and a notation in the company's accident log. What changed because of the explosion? Nothing. Not immediately. There were no safety regulations to violate, no OSHA inspections, no government mandates for equipment inspections or dry floors or ladle maintenance schedules. Workers' compensation wouldn't arrive in Pennsylvania until 1915, 8 years too late for the men who died in Butler. But the explosion was documented in the Factory Inspector, the unofficial journal of the International Association of Factory Inspectors, in reports compiled by state labor bureaus tracking industrial accidents, in the Pittsburgh Survey of 1907 to 08, a massive investigation that exposed industrial deaths and disfigurement in vivid detail and fueled a national push for safety reform. The explosion became a data point, one of hundreds, then thousands, documenting the human cost of unregulated industrial work. Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, just south of Butler, tracked 526 workplace deaths in a single year, 1906 to 1907. 195 of them were steelworkers. killed by molten metal, crushed by machinery, burned, dismembered, cooked alive. The numbers were staggering. In Pittsburgh's steel mills alone, fatal accidents accounted for 20% of all male deaths in the 1880s. The annual casualty lists read like battle reports from a war. 20 men killed this month, 30 the next, arms torn off, legs crushed, bodies incinerated, and every single one of them was ruled an accident, an unavoidable tragedy, the price of progress. Those numbers, accumulated over years, eventually forced change. Not because companies wanted to change, they didn't, but because the public couldn't ignore it anymore, because journalists like William Hard wrote exposés like Making Steel and Killing Men, because reformers like Crystal Eastman documented the carnage in work accidents and the law, because the cost, in lives, in families destroyed, in men crippled and discarded, became too visible to pretend it wasn't happening. Pennsylvania passed the Workers' Compensation Act in 1915. Companies, for the first time, were financially liable for workplace injuries. That created an incentive to actually prevent accidents, not out of morality but out of economics. Insurance companies started demanding safety inspections, equipment standards, training programs. If a worker got hurt, the company had to pay. If a worker died, the company had to pay the family. Suddenly, safety made financial sense. By the 1930s, steel mills were installing safety protocols, hiring safety inspectors, reducing the 12-hour shifts that made men too exhausted to avoid accidents. Fatality rates in steelmaking dropped dramatically between 1910 and 1940. Not to zero, but enough that explosions like Butler became rarer. Rare enough that when they did happen, they made national news instead of just local. The cupola furnaces themselves started disappearing. By mid-century, electric arc furnaces and induction furnaces were replacing cupolas. Cleaner, safer, more precise. No open flames, no manual tapping, no ladles swinging on chains over wet floors. The molten metal was contained, controlled, monitored. The risk didn't disappear, but it dropped. At Standard Steel Car, eventually Pullman Standard, the changes came slowly. New safety rules in the 1920s, better equipment in the 1930s, union contracts in the 1940s that gave workers the right to refuse unsafe work. By the 1950s, the plant had a safety department, regular inspections, protective equipment. Men still got hurt, but they didn't die at the rate they had in 1907. The Butler plant finally closed on February 4, 1982. Pullman Standard exited the railroad car business. Trinity Industries bought the property, ran it for a few more years, then abandoned it. In 2005, the plant was demolished. Half a mile of factory gone, scraped down to the foundations, turned into empty lots and parking. What remains? One office building on Hanson Avenue, a single restored Pullman Standard freight car sitting at the Butler Transit Authority as a monument. A few historical plaques, photographs in the Butler County Historical Society, and the memories of the families whose grandfathers and great-grandfathers worked there, built the cars, survived the furnaces, or didn't. Every steel railroad car rolling across America today owes something to Standard Steel Car Company, to Hanson's vision of standardized parts, to Brady's salesmanship, to the thousands of immigrant workers who melted the steel, cast the wheels, assembled the frames, to the men who died doing it. The Butler explosion didn't stop the steel industry. It didn't even slow it down, but it was counted, recorded, added to the ledger of industrial dead that eventually forced America to ask, how many men is progress worth? The answer, in 1907, was as many as it takes. By 1915, by 1930, by 1970, the answer started to change. Not because the steel got softer, but because the men who worked it demanded to be worth more than the metal they poured, because their widows demanded compensation, because their children demanded their fathers back, because eventually even the companies realized that dead workers don't build railroad cars, they don't make machines like the cupola furnaces anymore, and they don't kill men like they used to either, not because we got smarter, but because we finally started counting the cost, because we finally decided that a man's life was worth more than a production quota, because we finally wrote laws that said you can't just work someone to death and walk away. The monument at Butler Transit Authority, that restored freight car on original 1902 rails, doesn't mention the explosion. It celebrates the company, the achievement. And maybe that's right. Standard Steel Car did build America's railroads. But 24 men paid for that revolution with their lives, and they deserve to be remembered too.